Yeah,
All right,
that sounds good.
I'm gonna share
Um,
the screen now. Okay.
yeah, we'll try to keep it short, but it is a lot of information. And we, like Bobby said, came at it with a lot of different angles. And we're hoping to continue just our research because we're thinking a lot of things will come up in the next
Like those
couple
mailboxes.
weeks. Uh-huh. I know. I love the
You
partisanship. I
spray
thought
painted
I,
them.
yes.
So, as like just a brief intro, we explored not only, as Bobby said, what vote by mail is, but the different terms that you might hear, such as absentee voting, in
Mhm.
addition to vote by mail, and also what the effects are just in terms of partisan makeup, turnout, and finally, just, somewhat, Maggie did this a lot better than I could have, which was the demographics of who actually
Mhm.
votes by mail currently. And there's a lot of different moving pieces, so let's
Yeah,
get
it's it,
started.
we Reese and I kind of worked at it like we planned it out together and then worked at it at different times. So it's my chaotic energy was kind of all over this.
Yeah,
So
well, we started it with the outline. Like we initially just had a large
we
document of shared resources, and then a narrative kind of came from that.
uh-huh.
So, okay, so first slide, second slide.
So Reese, we can just take the ones we made and like just add on to each other. But basically, when I think about vote by mail, I think of these two problems. One is our president himself. And most recently, when he tweeted about vote by mail, he was fact checked finally and didn't like that. But this tweet just gives some context as to what he thinks about mail in voting, which a lot of the right think that it's fraud and that we have too much voter fraud. When really, if you've seen a movie like Rig, the voter suppression playbook, it will show you that there's not a lot of fraud happening. There's more voter suppression going on. And then recently, just with COVID, you can see, like we saw in Wisconsin, especially, and then in Georgia, and now in Kentucky, and just everywhere. And I'm afraid it's going to be everywhere in August and November. Is that the lines are just unbearable at this point, and it's dangerous because you can see some people without mask, most are with, but it's just not conducive to an election. So vote by mail is definitely a way in which we can.
Okay, so this video just some of us have never voted before, perhaps, and this video is just a little short explainer of what in a normal year it would look like. It's about 90 seconds.
Yeah, both the videos that they put in here are very brief, which was nice, but very accessible.
First time voter.
Are you ready to vote for the first time?
US.
If you're a U.S. citizen, meet your state's requirements, and will be 18 by election day, you can vote. But first, you need to register before your state's deadline. Check with your local election office. You can register there, or you may be able to register online at the Department of Motor Vehicles or using the National Mail Voter Registration Form. Your election office may send you a voter registration card listing your polling place. On election day, that's where you'll go. When you get there, you may need to show an ID to vote. Then fill out your ballot. If you don't know how, ask a poll worker. If you know you won't be able to get there on election day, you may qualify to vote by mail. Remember, voting rules are different in every state. Learn more about voting at usa.gov/voting.
Now, of course, that does not work in this time because of the, coronavirus, and the infrastructure we have set up literally only works when there is not a pandemic. And so that is why we're here where we are, where you see lots of polling stations closing down and then lines that are several blocks long with hour-long waiting lines because we have to social distance. And so this is just an explainer for what it used to be, and now we're moving on to where we are. And so Maggie and did a lot of the defining of terms, but a lot of these seem interchangeable, but they are not necessarily. So vote by mail is just the umbrella term, but postal voting could also be used. Mail-in voting, again, is slightly different, and absentee voting could also be another umbrella term. It's funny that all these are somewhat interchangeable, but they are distinct in their own ways in the sense that all of this is absentee, but not all of it is vote by mail, if that makes any sense.
Can I ask a question?
Different restrictions onto which ones you can.
Can I ask a question?
Go on.
Maggie, you have the term electors. Is that synonymous with voters?
Yes. Sorry, I froze and then my Wi-Fi cut out, and now I'm on.
Well,
my
no,
phone
I'm
audio.
because the term electors has another meaning too.
Yeah. So, in doing this and looking up each of these definitions, because when I would look up vote by mail, there would be multiple things that came up, and
Okay.
like postal was different than absentee, and so within postal, it's different because the definition uses electors specifically, and it basically means a voter, but postal voting is targeted towards older folks, whereas absentee voting is more so like if you're out of town or if you're a college student. So I would say it's just kind of a more official definition and a little more old term targeted towards their audience, but it really doesn't mean anything different in terms of like elector
Okay.
voter.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. And then yes, vote by mail and mail-in voting they sound the same, but just slight different people who use either.
I'll just go to the next slide.
Okay.
It's a lot of text. So this is the second video. This was done by 5:30. I really like this one. This is also really short.
Yeah, it's a good one.
With the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, there have been many calls for states to switch to vote by mail for the November elections. Currently, 5 states conduct their elections predominantly by mail: Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii. 29 more states, plus the District of Columbia, allow any voter to request an absentee ballot by mail without an excuse. However, the remaining 16 states still require voters to provide an excuse if they want to vote by mail, although some of these states might accept the coronavirus as a valid excuse, such as New Hampshire. Many people believe that voting by mail is the safest option for the November election because it minimizes in-person voting, which of course could spread the coronavirus. However, switching to vote by mail is easier said than done. First, states need to custom print the ballots and envelopes for every registered voter. Then they need enough staffers to stuff those envelopes with those ballots, and then to count the votes when they come back in. In the Wisconsin primary in early April, understaffed election officials had to work over 100 hours a week processing absentee ballot requests, and that was for a low turnout primary election. Imagine if this happened in all 50 states in the general election, which is much higher turnout. Of course, states could always hire more workers to handle the increased workload, but that would cost more money. An analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice estimated that switching to vote by mail for the November elections could cost up to $1.4 billion, most of which is simply postage. The states that are probably best equipped to switch to vote by mail without a problem for November are those that already see a lot of their voters voting by mail. For example, Montana and Arizona each sent more than 60% of their voters mail ballots in the 2018 election. It wouldn't be too hard for them to increase that to 100% for 2020. However, both states have Republican legislatures, and Republicans have been opposed to vote by mail efforts. Far more states, though, are not well prepared to switch to vote by mail. 29 states, plus the District of Columbia, sent mail ballots to less than 10% of their voters in 2018. For example, in New York, only 3% of voters got mail ballots. These states would have to scale up their mail voting apparatus in a big way in a very short period of time in order to be prepared for November. It remains to be seen how many states will tackle the Herculean task of switching to vote by mail for November. Experts agree that it takes a long time to get any vote by mail system right, so they need to start planning right away.
And so these are just screen grabs from an accompanying article that was with the video that shows the current state of vote by mail in America. And you see Missouri is yellow, which is there's an excuse required to vote absentee. However, it varies by some counties. And really the excuse thing is, you know, kind of liberally applied depending on where you go to vote. The county clerk may just believe whatever you say or may not ask for your excuse at all. Maggie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so like we said, like we heard with Eric on Friday, that with the amount of people who work polls and the amount of people who work at like election boards, it's so different that like maybe you go in and you can just get an absentee ballot and they don't ask for an excuse. So the excuse required, that can vary. But with the counties, that's important to see, and we might see more counties allow vote by mail, and then especially like with New Hampshire allowing coronavirus, we'll again hopefully see more of that. But as that video portrayed, it's not easy to do vote by mail, and it's really hard on states, but nevertheless they should do it.
And we're still, I think there was a bill in the General Assembly. We might have covered this in the PowerPoint, but there is a problem in Missouri. Some may not see it as a problem, where absentee ballots require a notarized signature, which don't know if you've all been outside lately. Chances are you haven't. It's hard to find a notary. Some people can self-notarize, but that itself gets more complicated. But I forget if we resolved that question.
So there's
I
more talk about taking the notary off and like eliminating that requirement, which is exciting, but who knows how far that's been. Bobby, sorry, were you gonna say something?
I was gonna say, yeah, I know, I can't remember. I know it was in the outline, the bit about notaries. And the thing is not, you have to like have a little bit of training and sign a document to become a notary, and you're not allowed really to charge for services. So there's a lot of people now that I've seen on like Reddit and whatnot, volunteering to go sit at a college campus or a public library and just notarize stuff for people. Because yeah, it's still, I think, up in the air in our own state how it's going to work.
And we put this graph in just a different format again to highlight that there are 5 states that do all mail elections, and Colorado and Oregon have some of the highest voter turnouts. So that makes a lot of sense. And if those 5 states can do it, then every other state can do it. And then again, just another graphic of those 5 states, and then the counties that can opt to use all mail-in elections, and then some elections can be run entirely. So those are the rules currently in those states. So Missouri's on there, which is cool. And then
yeah. Just another format, but maybe easier to read for some folks. And it just is talking about the deadlines to request absentee ballots. And you see Missouri is, you know, middling, as we typically are.
Really kind of you, Reese. But yeah, we're in the 30 to 45 days category.
And so this chart was from NPR, which was an article that Maggie sent me that I read through that was really informative, and maybe we'll drop that in the classroom. And it just shows how vote by mail has been growing over the years. And in 2018, we had about a quarter of voters vote by mail. Now, of course, it's probably going to be a little more than that now, and we're trying to build the infrastructure to do that. But a lot of voters are familiar with vote by mail, and many of us have already voted by mail. I have, since being at Truman. I think Maggie did from Worcester and others.
Also, that's how the military overseas votes. I mean, voting by mail isn't unheard of. That's always how stationed troops have done it in the United States.
Yes. I may have only ever voted once in person on election day. Oh, no, I didn't. Never mind. Stephanie and I early voted. Never mind. I have never voted on election day.
And then this is a distinction from the USA Gov website. I looked a lot into like the exact language that's used when people go and look for this information. And so it just distinguishes absentee voting versus all mail-in voting. And so really absentee voting is we wanted to talk about like how the excuses differ, because 2/3 of the states don't need an excuse, where in 1/3 an excuse is required. And so it's just researching voting, and I'm sure we'll all see this, is so frustrating because nothing is consistent about it. And so we see that in some states it's easier to get an absentee ballot year after year because you can get a permanent one. So let's say if you're like older or have a medical condition, or it would be nice if like you could tell like I'll be in college for 4 years, can you just give me my absentee ballot for the next 4 years? And then with all mail-in voting, that is, again, it's more of that permanent mindset where you are able, and it's everyone is able to mail in. All right.
So Maggie found all these different articles which say the exact same thing, which is mail-in voting or absentee voting has not been without its issues, because it is a learning curve for a lot of states that traditionally are not, traditionally do not have an absentee voter culture. A lot of you have seen like the long lines on Twitter and on television in the most recent like primary elections, especially in Wisconsin and in Georgia, and what was the most recent one, Kentucky. And so, you know, the results have been somewhat mixed. There have been some states that have seen greater turnout. However, some areas in those states, particularly in Wisconsin, like in Milwaukee, which has a disproportionately high African-American population, have not seen those same increases in voter turnout. And that is as much a result of confusion around the system as it is of some voters still preferring to vote in person on election day, but the number of polling locations being greatly reduced, like in Jefferson County, Kentucky, where I believe there were, you know, hundreds in that, and then on election day there was one.
And that's Louisville.
Yes.
And then I really liked this graphic because it showed in which the primaries were casted by postal voting. And so like Maryland, most of their primaries happen, the votes happen by mail-in. And then you can see just down the line. And it's interesting to see Wisconsin there. And then, I don't know, I was kind of surprised about these states, but then also like we obviously don't see Missouri or Alabama or all of those for a reason. So.
I was just gonna,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, then we just went into who supports vote by mail, which is most people. Mm-hmm. And then later we went into who opposes it, but Maggie did the research on who mostly supports it.
Yeah, and so I just highlighted 3 organizations, the Brennan Center for Justice, which a lot of my research about vote by mail came from that center. And they've thrown money at the problem and given $4 billion to Congress to protect election integrity, which includes being able to have more absentee voting. And then there's some PACs, Priorities USA, that have filed lawsuits within those who think that their voting has been disenfranchised because of like mail-in problems. And then the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is something there if you ever have a problem with your mail-in voting or absentee that you can go to, because they're often in the courtroom arguing for better use of mail-in ballots. And then the next one is opposed. Well, actually, this is supporting. There's a really interesting article about how many Republicans support mail-in voting. And that includes 65% of them in a poll again in April 2020. And then again, the Brennan Center conducted another poll in which 4 out of 5 Americans believe that all states should have the option for vote by mail. And then again, 57% of Republicans agreed that all states should. So that's pretty big. And I can
there seems to be only one big opponent, and that's the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And that's interesting because once again, vote by mail gets marketed as sort of a partisan issue when really it's not. Well, I mean, which makes sense. People want what's easy.
Yeah, because people.
Yeah.
So here you go. This slide is my favorite. But we also see why a lot of Republicans are afraid of vote by mail, especially during this time. But it's all the Republicans in power, and our president himself voted by mail. So like at the end of the day, Americans are lazy and they want to do the easiest thing possible. And the easiest thing possible for them is to not vote. But if they're able to just sign something and send it in and think, oh, I have a difference and my vote will be counted and all that, if they believe that, that's what they're going to do. But as of now, they don't care and they won't do it. And so, and when you see your president tweet all of these things over the past years, like the middle one is right after he won and said that he really thinks people vote illegally, and he perpetuates this theory that people are fraudulent in their vote.
And of course, Governor Parson in this state, who is not what you would call a progressive, has also had some troubling statements on voting when being pushed about expanding vote by mail in this state. I think he replied simply with, well, you know, if people don't feel safe voting, then they shouldn't.
Yeah.
Which is a somewhat wild thing to hear from someone who is an elected official, although he was never elected governor.
Elected, he inherited it from Greitens. So.
Yeah, and then again, there was a group that just donates hundreds of thousands of dollars to prevent vote by mail. So we're gonna go through this quickly, but pros and cons is that it's convenient, like I said, and then it also has shown better turnout, and it will help like those elections that aren't as popular get more vote, and then those who the low propensity voters, which I know I talk about on the campaign front, and I'm interested in talking more in this group and within our VEPs about low propensity voters. Because they're registered to vote, they totally can, but then they often don't show up. And then lastly, they are more secure. A lot of times they have time, I mean, this is the hope, is that they have more time beforehand and afterhand to like count them and organize them, but oftentimes these states are dealing with deadlines and get overwhelmed by the amount. So in theory, they're more secure, but and I hated that the cons outweighed the pros when I did this, but I thought these were really important. So when you're not at the polling place, you have no one to check it. So like for me, when I went to vote in June, I filled out the front page and then I went to go turn it in and it came back. And I was like, why did it come back? And it's because there was a back page. But the back page was something that was taken off the ballot. And like my sister flipped the page as a responsible citizen would, and I didn't, because I was like, oh, this is my ballot. This is what I knew was on it. This is what I'm voting for. But she was like, I don't remember seeing that. So I just said no. And then it didn't bounce back. But like, let's say that was something really important and you sent it in and you didn't get a vote for it. So it is good to be in person to check those errors right there. And then yet again, like if you're expecting everyone in the United States to mail in vote, but then there's very many communities who don't have access to do that. Like maybe they don't have postal boxes or can't get to the post office or don't have like a great mail system. Like especially it highlights Native Americans on reservation, and then those who are low income students.
Oh,
Did we lose
can
Meg?
everybody hear us?
Poses a problem.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. Reece, you can take the bottom too.
Okay, so opportunities for coercion is a very important point because it came up very recently in 2018 in North Carolina in the election for the 9th Congressional District. There was a very close election that had to be invalidated because the Republican side was traveling door to door in a couple of counties and doing ballot harvesting where they would, it was more of electoral fraud than voter fraud, but they were recording votes for themselves that did not exist. And that could happen on a smaller scale with, you know, family members. You know, they go to the nursing home to visit great grandma June and they say, oh, you know, we're voting for Trump. And, you know, they'd fill out her ballot and mail it back without asking her consent on any question. And, you know, there are limited cases of that, but it is still a problem that could happen. Of course, that could also happen in-person voting if you brought great grandma June to her polling location. And of course, slower result reporting. You know, at this moment, we're about a week out from the Kentucky primary and we still don't know who the hell won.
Yeah.
And that is just the nature of reporting results. Now, in some states, it's even slower. In California, for example, in 2018, they accept any ballot as long as it is postmarked by election day. So in theory, you could get, ballots up to a week after the election. And so we had a lot of congressional races who we didn't know who won until nearly December. And that could cause some problems on a national election where, we as Americans need instant gratification. And how are we supposed to have an election night special if we don't know who won on election night?
And then also with both of these, funding came up. So it could be cheaper in theory, but then also it could cost more for the state. And as the video from 538 showed, that it does take a lot of people to hire and to do it.
And so there's always this question of, how much fraud is there in an election? And it would actually appear that there's more fraud in states that require an excuse to vote absentee as opposed to just states with pure mail-in voting, which is not what Chris Kobach or maybe Brian Kemp at a different time would have told you, but that's just what the data bears out in this academic study that I found that is in our larger collection of notes.
And the other thing is also, look, this is such a tiny amount of fraud from something that actually makes me feel really good about the system is that this isn't like 20%. This is 0.4%. So we're doing something right. Or we're just not hitting the drug.
All right. Yeah. So this is a lot of words, but this was awesome because I found this academic journal, which basically said that vote by mail, it will not have it hasn't shown an effect on turnout, on either party's share of turnout. So like no party is helped or hurt by vote by mail. And it also doesn't increase the party's vote. And then it also increases average overall turnout. So it's just to make more people vote. It, like any Republican who says that it helps Democrats, it's both balanced. And this was done in response to like COVID and stressing more vote by mail.
Yes. And so this might be a little hard to see, but this is just an example of how there is not really a correlation on, partisan performance. In at least 2016, where we looked at how states did that, utilized vote by mail. And yeah, you see the top three are blue, but they might have just already been blue by the nature of it being Washington and Oregon. But, Utah and Arizona also utilize a lot of vote by mail, and they've been Republican since 1996. And so what you just see as you go down the list is there's not really a correlation between how many, ballots are cast by mail versus who wins that state. And this is another way of showing this. There is like a minor trend line that shows, the more ballots you cast, perhaps the more, the more democratic the result will be, but it's fairly scattered. There's not a whole lot of correlation. It's very slight, very, very slight. But you can even see at the end of the chart there, about 45% of ballots cast by mail still, resulted in, President Trump receiving nearly 60% of the vote. So it's less about how you vote, but just simply who is voting. And if you have vote by mail in, I don't know, Macon County, Missouri, that doesn't really change the fact that Donald Trump's going to win it by 70 points. Just maybe there will be more voters. And just finally, to, really hone in on this partisanship thing, Florida Republicans return more ballots than Democrats. So if anything, there may be like Republicans should be a little more pro vote by mail, because just because you send ballots out to everyone does not mean that Democrats are the only ones sending them back. It's more a reflection of who supports your campaign, whose voters are energized. And so if you're losing an election, whether it was vote by mail, you may have lost it anyway.
And then Switzerland, always on top of it. Switzerland, anyone can vote by mail, and they do it a few weeks before the election. And so all voters receive a ballot, And then they're able to vote and then send it in leading up to election day. So kind of like California, like postmarked. As that's their voting, which it works. And Switzerland seems to be doing well. And then lastly, again, just pulling out the headlines because a lot of people are nervous. A winner on election day in November, don't count on it. Like more and more, like in 2016, we saw that like 2 a.m. was pretty like abnormal to find out, but now we're like a week later is crazy. But then both Democrats and Republicans are nervous, disagreeing on different issues of why that can be nervous. But voter rights, like Republicans and Democrats just differ a lot in which they want their people to vote. But the New York Magazine had an article, are we headed into a voter suppression catastrophe in November? Quite possibly. And then just what we've seen in primary elections, it hasn't been good.
And we'll go a little more rapid fire on these last few because I realize that Maggie and I are second to Gabe for most verbose.
Yes, true. It goes Gabe, me, and then Reese.
Yes. This is just information from, it just so happened to be from the state Democratic Party, but I'm sure the Republicans put out information on voting as well. And these are just the deadlines in order to register and apply for different kinds of ballots. And on the right is an explainer on how to vote absentee.
For the state of Missouri only.
Yes. And then we've got just a little more information about Missouri, I believe, from the Secretary of State website, but Maggie, I'm not sure. And then we have, a description of who is considered at risk for COVID, who may be, when we talk about people using coronavirus as an excuse, we might see this come up as a guideline for who can use coronavirus as an excuse to vote absentee, as opposed to you have to be out of town or something else. I'm sorry, I don't have anything to say. This is just,
So
there's a lot of recent
thing.
Maggie and Reese worked very hard at keeping this as up to date as possible, but we were joking about even a month from now, there's a lot of this information that might be completely different because it is just constantly evolving.
Yeah, so like it was great to see that Governor Parson actually did something. And then we can just, this is the last part, the demographics, and we can just slide through this, but it's really interesting. It gives you all the information, and this is based in 2016, and it's by race, age, family income, and then we'll get into a little more, but it's just interesting to see down the line. And we'll show you this because I recommend just looking through this because it's really interesting of who
votes by mail is what Maggie would have said.
Who has an excuse, no excuse, and then the confidence.
Yeah, and how it's all picked up. So that was it. That's the end of the presentation.